hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal.
You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite.
Welcome to Unscripted with Daniel, your free, independent news source for Valparaiso and Indiana politics. Welcome to episode 4 of Unscripted with Daniel. Today, I want to cover political expression in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination. I want to cover what type of political expressions there are, what you can do locally, what type of political expressions should be off the table, and what's free speech. I want to talk about what the limits are to it legally and what fascists like to do with it. I also want to cover some events that happened as an effect of the assassination, as well as some national events as an effect of the assassination. So, we got a pretty dense show today, and I hope you enjoy. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. There are many ways to express our discontent within our democratic American political system. We can vote, protest, boycott, and commit violence. But most of all, people agree that that last option should be left off the table. Why in our society do we see political violence as wrong or even counter to the American project? Simply, we have a constitution to back up the freedom of speech. It's the First Amendment, and therefore our speech should be used in the stead of violence. We use words to convey information, sharing our perspectives in an effort to show why an other should think and, as an effect, vote a certain way. Our voice or free speech is a tool by which one can sway others through a free market of ideas. It is through those healthy dialogues that a democracy can flourish, as through that communication, over time, a majority hopefully will coalesce around similar ideals and policies. Violence would be the last thing on the mind of an engaged citizenry, and a citizenry that feels their voices are heard and reflected in their government's actions. Our partisanship, if it keeps us from uniting together for better living conditions, is to the detriment of our country and our people. In the two-party system that we have, maybe it's hardly avoidable if we're separate, alone and looking at our screens. But if we get local and if we see people in person where there's no party official that can get in between you and your neighbors, I believe it's far easier for people to empathize and sympathize with those who they can actually see in their immediate surroundings, and therefore they are the most worth engaging with, as opposed to an online faceless entity with only their words to judge them by. There are so many ways we can do this locally. In Valparaiso, Maggie Clifton has worked to empower local community by allowing citizens to create their own neighborhood groups. These groups can come together and meet routinely to plan events and get grants for improvements in their own neighborhood. Bumpy, cracked, uneven sidewalk, want some paths near a playground, a wildflower meadow. All these things are examples of things you can do using a neighborhood grant with your neighbors to form community and make change locally. This activity locally replaces the angst of an isolated and atomized population. In terms of incentives, local action is incentivized to do good for people and to empathize despite our differences, while online communication incentivizes fighting, attention, clicks, and the fear of difference. When we have a lack of empathy, that's called apathy. Maybe we have that for some outgroup. Maybe we have that for our neighbors just because we don't associate with them very much. But when we have a lack of care for people and their feelings, let me ask you this. Is it more or less likely for violence and hate to be brought against them? Are you more likely to feel that way about somebody who, well, you already didn't care about? It's clear to me the answer to that is yes. When one dehumanizes individuals or groups, one sets expectations for their lack of rights and can justify in their minds violence against them. The right dehumanizes immigrants and many other groups. The left, well, not nearly as atrocious, could be more empathetic to those that think differently. The right is horrible, don't get me wrong. On a policy basis, they strip rights, legal protections, social security nets, and they take them away from the most vulnerable people. However, ultimately, a democracy needs to come to a majority decision. So communication is essential for that process to take place. We should accept we could be wrong about things and understand that all perspectives are formed only by the organization our brains bring about by a collection of experiences that we have and information that we have seen and have processed in some way. But keeping that in mind, we should be open to talking people who think differently and to empathize with them, even if they won't empathize with us, as long as we're staying safe. For example, a protest is a great opportunity to communicate well. A good protest communicates well to the audiences that one would like to convince. This could be people in power or passersby who are currently of the same view or different views. One can easily regurgitate talking points no matter the ideological persuasion one comes from. But to actually tailor a message for those who think differently to cause them to expand their perspective is another thing entirely. In order to expand someone else's perspective, you will have to have someone who is, in a way at least, open to information. Some are not. Someone once said, those convinced against their own will are of the same opinion still. But, if they're open, then try to empathize with them. Argue from their position why a new bit of information should be important to them, and why it would be in their best interest to vote differently as an effect of that new piece of information. So great, we're using our free speech to convince others, to communicate with others in good faith, to understand the issues that our society faces. That's wonderful. Free speech is a messy thing. It's an internal monologue turned external. Sometimes it's loud and obnoxious. Sometimes it's concise and incisive in its expression. It's a reflection of the individual. So, as the diversity of individuals is so great, the question should be not what is permissible speech, but instead what is not permissible speech. What is not permissible to say says a lot about how the society or current administration likes to operate. We should try to understand the context of where the U.S. is legally with free speech. So, what's free speech? Well, as I said earlier in the video, there's the First Amendment. And let's just go ahead and read that. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that's the First Amendment. There's also court cases that have shaped free speech over time, one of them being Schenck v. United States. This involved Charles Schenck and Elizabeth Baer. They were socialists, but this fact really isn't relevant to the actions that they took, apart from the political dynamics at the time allowed for the government to more easily suppress the speech of these individuals, as people were primed against communists and socialists coming off of the coattails of McCarthyism of the Cold War. Those actions being the distribution of brochures that stated the draft for the Vietnam War was a violation of the 13th Amendment that prevents involuntary servitude. They wanted people to resist the draft and only do so peacefully. The courts decided that this was in violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. The Espionage Act itself was passed in order to stifle, as you can tell by the name, espionage, but also any criticism of drafts or World War I. The act was amended with an expansion called the Sedition Act Amendments that contained the following language. It made it illegal to, in its words, willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States. I don't know about you, but to me that seems like a bit much. Makes me think, free speech is sort of in a sorry state. One could argue that free speech, as we thought of it, as most Americans thought of it, died a long time ago. Looking both at Schenck v. United States and the passage of the act, there's continuity with some more recent cases, like Julian Assange. He was also charged under the Espionage Act. We can start to see a trend here where the speech is not something that will harm a fellow citizen necessarily, but instead hurt the image of the federal government when the state is practicing violence upon others, whether that is upon foreign adversaries or domestic threats. These days, it seems American citizens are here at the discretion of the ruling elite, not upon our own volition. Once we're suspect of even slighting them, we're cut down. An example of this is the Patriot Act. I quote it from this book, The Rule of Law by Tom Bigham. It states, "It made foreign nationals deportable for speech, for innocent associational activity, and subject to incarceration by the Attorney General's say-so. Additionally, 80,000 Muslims and Arabic men were made to register on a watch list. 5,000 were placed in preventative detention in the first 2 years after 9/11. All of them, by the way, found to be innocent." Let's see, are there any other examples of broad profiling efforts by the federal government as an attempt to root out terrorism? The murder of Charlie Kirk is an example of political violence and is abhorrent. However, the reaction by the administrative state to the killing has been perhaps even more worrisome. There have been two very significant reactions to this event. The executive administration calling for citizens to rat out others for speech that does not praise the life of Charlie Kirk, and the National Security Presidential Memorandum, or NSPM-7, put out by Donald Trump. It contains the following language. "This anti-fascist lie has become the organizing rally cry
used by domestic terrorists to wage a violent assault against democratic institutions, constitutional rights, and fundamental American liberties. Common threads animating this violent conduct include the anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American values on family, religion, and morality, as described in the order of September 22nd, 2025, designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. The groups and entities that perpetuate this extremism have created a movement that embraces and elevates violence to achieve policy outcomes, including justifying additional assassinations. For example, Charlie Kirk's alleged assassin engraved the bullets used in the murder with so-called anti-fascist rhetoric.
This is a massive conflation of generally left-wing characteristics with an assassin who doesn't even fit this criteria. The killer in this case was barely political and has no association with groups that call themselves Antifa apart from the bullet casings that say, "Eat this fascist." Antifa is itself a shortening of anti-fascist, which is not explicitly violent, but there have been people who have committed violence under that banner, but only one group in my lifetime has stormed the Capitol and committed violence, and that's MAGA. All this does is open up the floodgates to persecuting not just terrorists, but political enemies. One who is anti-fascist, instead of having disdain for immigrants and foreigners, has empathy for and appreciates them. Anti-fascists believe in the freedom of the press, while fascists oppress speech that is counter to their dear leader. Anti-fascists see the value in diversity, while fascists seek to force all citizens into uniformity or remove them. Anti-fascists believe in the Constitution. Fascists hate the Constitution as the rights it grants get in the way of their cruelty. The Republican Party has elevated Charlie Kirk to a near sacred status. To question him, according to the rhetoric at the Charlie Kirk Memorial and the speeches that happened there, is to basically risk social and professional exile for one. Tucker Carlson compared Kirk to Jesus Christ and the achievements of Jesus in his life, which seems a bit sacrosanct, as well as saying that Charlie Kirk is what a true American looks like. Okay, interesting. This narrative not only sanctifies Charlie Kirk, but also delegitimizes or attempts to delegitimize any criticism of him. While all this is going on, there's a mutual paranoia between Republicans and Democrats about violence. Each group imagines the other is far more likely to commit political murder against them than is actually the case, overestimating the threat by a factor of 20. In reality, about only 2% of either party supports partisan murder, and only about 4% support violent assault or arson against political opponents. This exaggerated fear justifies extreme responses and suppressions of speech on both sides. However, the extent to which the Trump admin has used suppressive tactics is unprecedented. When you actually look, though, at the political affiliation of those who are committing school shootings, you see that it skews far to the right and not the left, which is, in fact, a study that the administration had deleted. I wonder why. In the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder, you have J.D. Vance go onto Charlie Kirk's show and basically legitimize the firing and, in a way, disempowerment of anybody who dares besmirch the name of their sacred cow, Charlie Kirk. The broadness, of course, of the security memoranda that we previously discussed that the president put out goes beyond just a rooting out of terrorists, but it is also going after ordinary citizens for their political beliefs. For years, conservatives lamented woke cancel culture and the restrictions of hate speech laws abroad. Yet today, the same movement cheers on the public shaming and firing of political rivals, those who express relief at the death of a man who spread fascism, sexism, racism, and blamed marginalized groups for school shootings, and then stated the real problem was gang violence to young Americans, are now being targeted. The message is clear. Criticize this firebrand and you may lose your job. Nationally, Jimmy Kimmel was removed after the FCC chair threatened to revoke the license of ABC as an effect of Kimmel's criticism of Trump. You know, when he was asked by a reporter if he was doing all right after the death of Charlie Kirk just a day after, Trump responded by basically saying he's doing fine and he's really looking forward to the new ballroom they're building. We can all understand the president is a busy man, but his response shows that he's ready to move on a little too quickly, especially after someone who dies who was instrumental in bringing in new Republican young voters. So, as an effect of what Kimmel said on his show, the FCC decided to threaten ABC with the revocation of their broadcasting license if they didn't take down Jimmy Kimmel. So, naturally, ABC stood up for what was right. No, just kidding. They took him down, and then the people spoke. People canceled their Disney Plus. Anything that had to do with ABC, they canceled, and the stock took a hit. And naturally, when money's involved, they brought Kimmel back just 3 days later. There have been people taken out of teaching positions, out of many positions, just for sharing their political opinion online, nationally, everywhere. And this is just their political opinion. How could they do this as Republicans, people who are supposedly in love with the idea of free speech? It used to be one of their biggest rallying cries. You know, free speech can be offensive speech, right? Many conservatives have said a line somewhere along the lines of, you know, what are we making, comedy illegal? And the answer is emphatically yes, comedy and political expression. And it's the right that's doing it. The right might think this shows strength, but in fact the opposite is actually true. Resorting to professional punishment and weird executive orders that get passed down through the security state really shows that rather than engaging with the criticism, it reveals an inability to actually debate with the substance of the issue. It exposes a weakness at the heart of this movement, one that cannot withstand the scrutiny without silencing its opponents. So, with this topic, there's kind of a lot going on, so I wanted to get someone else's perspective on it. A local WVLP contributor who is a host of The Buzz. His name is Robert Jakowski. He has a running theory on how society works, and it sort of is simple, and basically it is a combination of religion and politics, and it, in this particular situation, is relevant in his mind. Let's go ahead and jump in to this interview, and he can explain why it is relevant.
I think it boils down to this religion politics thing. And I think a lot of the response to Charlie Kirk is due to the fact that he was this professed Christian. He had his, I'll just say it in the most neutral way I can, and it's going to take an effort on my part. He had an honorary doctorate from Liberty University. Again, coming back to Liberty University and the religion politics thing, the Charlie Kirk thing. Charlie Kirk's association with Liberty is another obvious tell for me. He has an honorary doctorate, whatever that means, from Liberty University. That tells me what he's all about. And I say that not in a necessarily a positive way. When I hear that, a red flag goes up for me. Charlie Kirk, Liberty University, because I think Jerry Falwell, 80s, all that whole thing with moral majority. And I think a big part of his appeal, again, this religion politics thing, a big part, I watched a little bit of the ceremony in this arena. It looked like a revival.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've watched these things since the 80s. I've watched these massive gatherings of Christians in these big arenas, and that's what it looked like to me. And it was concerning. And I think that this notion of what you were reading before, that was very, very effective, and that was a good description of what was going on there with the whole religious thing. His Christianity was a big part of what he was selling.
Are you talking about when I read what Tucker Carlson said? Or were you talking about when I read the NSPM 7? I read directly from the NSPM 7.
Well, I think it probably was both.
Okay.
I'm not recalling it word for word, but I think both are supportive of the notion that there's clearly a Christian foundation for all of this. And what it leads to is this notion that somehow if you say something negative, it's a persecution. That word persecution comes in.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, no. Let's step back for a second. It's not persecution.
It's really definitionally what fascism is, right? Where we have a dominant or a group that feels that they are the dominant and rightful heir to the country and their traditions, and they're essentially saying anyone outside of those traditions is an enemy of the state. And it's plain and simple written here that anyone who's an anti-fascist is an enemy of the state. Now, who would be afraid of an anti-fascist?
You know, someone posted on I guess it's Facebook, but it comes up on my phone every so often, that some of our greatest presidents were Antifa. And there's a photograph of Eisenhower and FDR, Roosevelt.
Right, they were anti-fascist.
They're anti-fascist. And my father fought in Europe against the fascists. And so it's ironic and hilarious to me that Antifa is somehow inimical to what the United States is all about. First of all, it doesn't even exist. It's just a name. It's not an organization of any kind. It's just a designation. And it means anti-fascist. So if you're Antifa, that's supposed to be a good thing in the United States.
Right.
And I just listen to them and I think either you're just lying through your teeth or you're stupid, or both. I don't know which one it is, but it can't be anything that's this side of or approaching intelligent, thoughtful conversation or narrative. Because to call Antifa somehow a terrorist organization is...
I remember back when I was Republican, there was news fed to me about people who claimed that groups of people who were committing violence were Antifa. Now, were they? Or were they just crazy people committing violence? And, I honestly think that right now there is a real fascist threat. We have a duty to be anti-fascist if we want to have a democracy. And I think it's just a blatant way of stifling the real criticisms that people have of the federal government in this time.
again, I go back to this statement I made earlier about how I've been around for a few years. And this is unrecognizable. This country that I'm living in now is unrecognizable from the one I lived in the 60s and the 70s, and a good part of the 80s, let's say the first half of the 80s, where if you disagreed with someone politically, it wasn't this personal thing. I've just noticed it. I probably had an incident 20 years ago where after the 2004 election, and W got reelected. And someone asked me, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And I said, he's an idiot. He's got to go. And the person took it all personally. I'd insulted his family, and I couldn't believe it. I said, all I said was I just expressed a political opinion. But again, going back to the religion politics thing, we have religion since the 70s, again, the 70s, 80s thing, that Jerry Falwell business. Religion has so infiltrated our politics and our public discourse that you can't even talk about politics anymore without offending someone, because now you're getting into their faith life.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? That's, I think, the key problem in our country. And I'm not sure if people even recognize that's the reason for the coarseness of our public discourse. It's because people have conflated, and I'm not saying there's a problem with it. Religion and politics are connected. They were connected when I was a kid in the 60s, but, somehow it worked.
I think it is kind of a problem because, we often get these dialogues where the right says something like, this is a Christian nation, when explicitly the founders in the First Amendment, they say we are not going to establish a single religion. We are a country that is open to all. In fact, I was watching a video, I think it was from PBS, where there was people from multiple religions going over. Someone who was even a Muslim came over and talked to one of the founding fathers as well. I mean, it's like from the beginning, we were open to this, and we understood that the nation should not have a divine right leader. That's what a king is. So therefore, no kings. That's what that is. and so it goes back to what Republicans say, we're a Christian nation. That's a problem. There's the offense.
Without a doubt. And I know it's one has to be careful with one's words, I suppose. But the fact of the matter is, the revolutionary thing, one of the most revolutionary things about the American Revolution, maybe the most revolutionary thing about the Revolution, the American Revolution, is that authority does not come from the divine source. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and so forth, we, the people, are the authority, the final authority. Now, everyone has religious belief, of course. But in the United States, the divine right of kings was no longer. There was a break from that whole European thing. That was the key to the Enlightenment, I think, is that human beings have the ability to discern right and wrong. Whatever your religious belief, and I think most Christians would agree that murder is unacceptable, or that theft is unacceptable, and that corruption is not a good thing. So I think the conflict, here's what it boils down to, and I'm just going to be blunt. Because the United States I grew up in was Martin Luther King's interpretation of the Bible. Love your brother. Give to those who do not have. Fight injustice. When there's racial injustice or gender injustice, you fight that injustice. You work for justice, not profit. You work for justice. The prosperity gospel is, the conflict is between the Martin Luther King gospel of sharing the wealth, taxing the rich, spreading the wealth, so that everybody, all boats rise, not just the billionaires, as Bernie's billionaires, right? And the banksters.
Right.
This is a big problem in the country, is this discrepancy between the rich and the poor. That's the United States I grew up in. All those great, even the Kennedys. I grew up Catholic, and the Kennedys were heroes of mine. John Kennedy, RFK, whatever their faults, John Kennedy and RFK were right squarely in that camp with King and all these great the Berrigan brothers, all these activist Catholic priests and nuns were heroes of mine. Yeah. And now I look 40, 50 years on, and the script has entirely flipped. And the conflict is not, I would argue, it's not even so much Republican-Democrat. It's the King gospel as opposed to the Trump gospel, or the Russell Vogt, who's also a Catholic, his gospel, or Martin Luther King's gospel, which I would argue Jesus' gospel for King, and I don't know whose gospel Vogt is preaching. But this, to me, is and this is why people get so upset. This is why the political discourse is so disjointed and awful, because we're not just talking about politics now. We're talking about which Bible are you talking about here?
It's really almost like there are two different gods that the left and the right worship. And it's very, unfortunately, selective, where, there are a lot of passages that justify the love of your neighbor. And I mean, it seems like it's overwhelmingly so that's the case. That there is injustice, but we should strive for justice, to look after the widow, to look after the sojourner, to, care about everyone, Jew or Gentile or whatnot. So it's two different gods, essentially.
And to bring it back to your Charlie Kirk question, this is why he was such a lightning rod, so to speak. Charlie Kirk focused a lot of energy on that whole thing, and I think it's clear where Charlie Kirk stood. Yeah. He would not agree with Martin Luther King and King's interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount or the Gospel of Jesus of Nazareth. Kirk was preaching something entirely different. I think he was a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist. I believe he said, "I am a Christian nationalist," which again sends up 5 more red flags. After the honorary doctorate from Liberty University, another 5 red flags went up when he said Christian nationalist. There are books on the subject now, and Americans should be deeply, at least constitutional Christian, true Christian Americans should be deeply concerned about Christian nationalism. It's a deeply disturbing mindset and ideology that has currency in academia. I've got books on my shelf at home. There's a Harvard professor named Vermeule who has written a book that defends this notion of maybe representative democracy is not the best way to go. Maybe monarchy or some authoritarian form of government is the way we should be going here. And that's concerning to me. Russell Vogt and Peter Thiel is another name.
Peter Thiel.
Who is very much on board with this, the Napa Institute and these think tanks that promote this kind of thing. It's going on in graduate schools, law schools, graduate schools of business. This is being taught. It's a program called Law and Economics. There's all kinds of documentation about this. Wow. That a lot of the people that are sitting on the Supreme Court, for example, and elsewhere around the country, lawyers, judges, are being put through these seminars on something called Law and Economics, where it's and the simplest term is neoliberalism, where it's all about no regulation. Take as much regulation away as possible, disempower the states or the nations, and the corporations take over. The corporation, and if you think about it, just look at the news. The corporations are really determining policy these days. The governments are finding themselves, it's one thing to complain about the government, and it's their own fault that it happened because they allowed it to happen. And again, I've got 50 years of watching this happen. The laws have been changed to create the economic situation we live in now. And of course, we only have a certain amount of time here to talk about this, but I throw it out there. Maybe it's for a future conversation. I don't know. I'm open to that. Yeah. But there's, again, going back 50 years, at least 50 years, this gradual infiltration of the business gospel, where the market solves all of our problems. The government's got to get out of the way. Right. And this, again, opposes the America I grew up in. I grew up in the FDR New Deal, where the government was involved in subsidizing housing for my father, not just minorities, people like my father, veterans coming back from World War II, took advantage of Federal Housing Administration, FHA programs, so that construction people, I mean, the profit margins are no better then than they are now. Builders complain now, we can't build these small affordable houses because there's no profit margin for us. We've got to build these big mansions with 3-car garages and 500 acres around them. The house my father built and the neighborhood I grew up in were these cookie-cutter houses. But steel workers and refinery workers and auto workers had homes that they could own and take care of and raise families in. And the government made that possible because of Franklin Roosevelt. And then Truman after him, and Eisenhower after him, and Kennedy and Johnson. And even Nixon, I'll give him credit, because he came out of that as well. I got my college education with zero debt because the government was subsidizing. One of the biggest problems with college tuition nowadays is that the governments are pulling back, the state governments especially, but the feds are subsidizing less and less and less of college education. And I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but my original point was that this group with people like Paul Weyrich and Peter Thiel and Russell Vogt, those are the people who've been quietly, James Buchanan, I could go on and on with names, Milton Friedman, all these people, names you'd probably recognize, have been working for 50 years to overturn that system that got me a cheap college education and my friends a cheap college education, my father and the people after him an affordable house that made sense. And debt wasn't this crushing thing that has people, homelessness was a non-issue when I was a kid.
Wow.
And
I can't imagine it being not an issue, because it's always been an issue since I've been around.
Right. You know what I mean? I think people don't understand. There was no homelessness. I mean, I'm sure it existed, but not that. I never saw it. Everybody had a place to go. And I'm sorry, I'll wrap it up by saying this. It's because the laws have changed. And it's because the citizens fell asleep at the wheel a little bit. The legislators that they elected bought into this whole gospels, I'll call it gospel. And here's where we find ourselves. And we need to be aware of that in order to make the change I think that we need to make.
I think that the attachment to fascist ideology is directly related to the economic circumstances that somebody finds themselves in. And it is direct. I think it's directly correlative. They're finding a group, something to blame in order to make their country great again, and therefore get their economic status back, because they feel the immigrants are taking our jobs away, and et cetera, et cetera. It all builds from that sort of out-group hatred or at least suspicion of, and that's where we're at. And it really ties up the whole memoranda that I read in the beginning. It is a suspicion of those who are different, who are from a different country, who have a different religion, who have a different sexuality, who have a different family structure, etc., etc., etc. We are only white Christian, or maybe they're expanding the tent to different race, but as long as you're mentally, ideologically in line, we don't mind. But essentially, if you're not the same as us, you're out. That's fascism, and it's a sad thing.
And again, it goes back to this notion that when you say something, you're offending me personally because it's my faith. 50 years ago, it was a different atmosphere. I'm not sure what people would have said. When I was just a kid, I was fairly young during the Kennedy years and the Johnson years, but I do remember that there were people who were happy at JFK, at what happened to JFK. That's a fact. There were people who were really happy about that. But the social media thing didn't exist back then.
Right.
There were people who were absolutely vicious with regard to Lyndon Johnson and his position on the Vietnam War. The ugliest things you could possibly imagine were said about Lyndon Johnson, but the social media thing wasn't there. And on top of that, again, this Christian thing wasn't predominant. It wasn't a defining factor in our political discourse. So it happened, but it didn't have the impact it's having now. I think social media is part of it, but I think another big part of it is that people, it feels like you're getting in their faith and you're insulting their faith. It's one thing to insult my politics. That I can handle. When you're getting on my faith, that's a different story. And I think that's the big difference. Social media plus the religious infiltration and the permeating of our political discourse with this religious thing. And I just wanted to go back and say, just to clarify earlier, it's a problem. But I think the problem is not to talk about is to not. The solution is not to avoid talking about religion and politics. The solution is to learn how to talk in civil tones and listen to people, and then you have to face at some point you have to face the question, like we were saying earlier, which Bible are you talking about here? It passes belief that someone could look at that situation and then think that it would be appropriate to end that person or cause a situation where that person's employment would stop. Just taking the whole picture. Okay, maybe she said something that some people found ill-advised, let's say, or just could have been left unsaid, but to take her personal situation into consideration and then to say, yes, the correct solution is to create a situation where she either loses her job or has to give up her job, is so lacking in compassion to me. A fundamental Christian virtue of compassion is to be
it's not there.
It's just not there, and it's unacceptable. That lack of compassion and lack of perspective is just the kindest thing I can say is just unfortunate.
Yeah, and it's only out of a few words that a person spoke for just years and years and years. They're like, we are against woke cancel culture. We are against restrictions on speech. And, it's just totally, absolutely hypocritical, the things that we're seeing right now.
I mean, I had teachers that said things in my high school classes or my college classes, and I'm thinking, man, these days, they'd at least be before the board, or they'd have some kind of hearing at least to investigate it. And I'm thinking, man, that was what education was all about. Even in high school, that's what education's all about.
Being able to say your opinion.
Right. Your informed opinion, hopefully.
Right.
But yeah, you were allowed to express your views without concern that you'd be somehow endangered or ostracized or, yeah.
I think that basically this type of reaction, some might interpret it as something that is a strong thing to do. I'm getting rid of my enemies because of their sins, whatever you want to say. And I think the opposite is true. That, you are going to resort to a professional punishment because you can't engage with the ideas that they're actually saying. You are going to legally or professionally punish these people. It just exposes a weakness that they have. They can't argue against the fact that Charlie Kirk has said some of the most abhorrent things about black people, saying that if there was a black person flying this plane, then you know what? They probably didn't work hard to get here. Those are basically his words. He said things like those over and over again. So can't say that it's something that he was taken out of context on. This is just his view. IQ science, essentially.
And I respond again with the obvious, what I consider to be the obvious answer. Your supposed role model, Jesus said, you have heard it said, love your enemy or love your friends, hate your enemies, or whatever. But I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And that's not easy to do, but that's the challenge. Mm-hmm. And I argue that for all the things Jesus did, there were two things that he did, I think, that really get overlooked quite a bit. The first thing he did was he called out hypocrisy constantly. He does it 8 times in Luke, I think. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. There's like the 7 woes, I think they're called. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. He says it 7 times. And 7 is a significant number, by the way. And he also says, a second thing he does is he reinterprets the law constantly. And he does it in Matthew's gospel, just to give you one example. You have heard it said, but I say to you. You have heard it said, but I say to you. You have heard it said, but I say to you. He does it, I think he does that 8 times. And that's one of them, by the way. You have heard it said, love your friends and hate your enemies. But I say to you, no, you pray for your enemies and love your enemies as well. So it all to me, this all, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm rambling. This is all connected stuff to me. It all is... All these various things we've been talking about, to me, they're one theme. It all dovetails down into one thing. This notion of integrity and taking responsibility for making a good argument. How can you argue, if you call yourself a Christian, how can you argue from Scripture that it's okay for a person who is, let's say, in a situation where maybe they're in a single parent household and they have children, maybe a special needs person, and it's okay to cost that person his or her livelihood. That means you haven't thought it through. To me, that's what it means. You haven't thought it through. It's a knee-jerk reaction that's completely unwarranted, and I think that's the challenge we face.
We've learned a lot throughout this episode, so let's review. We've learned about political expression, free speech, good methods on engaging with others to change minds, and why that's essential for a functional democracy. We've looked at free speech and the laws that shaped it in the modern day. We've related that to the overreaction by the federal government to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and how free speech is once again put in the crosshairs. We talked to my friend from The Buzz about how religion and politics is driving the current political dynamic, as well as a little bit of the history that led up to the modern-day MAGA movement. Before I go, I feel like I want to explain the purpose of what I feel I'm doing here on Unscripted with Daniel, and I also want to talk about some topics that just don't fit into this larger topic of political expression exactly in the context of it that I was talking about, because I think these things are important. So here at Unscripted with Daniel, I want democracy to work. I am trying to stand up for justice in the ways that I can. I covered the Valparaiso Human Rights Council and its importance in protecting the marginalized. I talked with local PhD political scientists to talk about the state of our democracy, to learn about what we can do as people to make us have a better society, despite the sorry state of our democracy. And I covered the Million Bob March that aims to bring back funding for PBS with the joy of protest. And now we covered the threat to free speech as an effect of Charlie Kirk's assassination. I'll continue to cover topics like these, with the ultimate aim being to empower through information. With that being said, there are so many topics, like I said, that don't quite fit this topic I was just talking about, but are really important, so I want to go over those. I want to talk about the concerted effort to cement one-party rule for the right wing. The Supreme Court has been given a case that involves the Voting Rights Act, specifically the second section of the VRA that prevents the suppression of representation of a race or color by forbidding gerrymandering that would effectively prevent that race from electing representatives of that race's choice. This is basically just another tool in the right-wing authoritarian playbook to make it so that they can cement their rule. If they can suppress those groups of people or any group of people based on race, then they can cement their foothold in our elections for generations. While people are protesting this dictator, the Supreme Court is deciding on this case right now. It's not just President Trump. If they state that adding another district for representation of African Americans is not constitutional, then essentially Section 2 of the VRA has been chipped away. According to legal experts, this will have nationwide and lasting effects. There are so many fronts on which our rights are being eroded. Our rights to vote and to have fair representation, the right to fair trial and due process, and the right to free speech are all under attack. While there are attacks on our rights, we have a complete restructuring of the government where the executive is unaccountable to anyone, it seems, where the president can just say, you know what, we're going to get rid of this program, and he's not going to wait for Congress to say so. And then we have the Supreme Court saying that when the president is doing anything, as long as it is actions that are related to the presidency, then they can't be prosecuted for it. This was the decision they reached when talking about the actions that the president took on January 6th. Then, of course, we have the executive firing of government employees, shutting down programs, denying of aid for things that have already been decided upon by Congress, as we already went over, whereas the process is meant to be Congress spends the money and the president can veto it at the time of passage of the spending. He's not following the process because he has no respect for the balance of powers that America's founders created. His only interest is, let's be honest, money. So it should be no surprise that Trump's cabinet is filled with billionaires that would love nothing more than to destroy government programs, even if it harms American citizens, just so that they can step in to privatize and profit from their poverty. They're just playing the game called capitalism. In the end, just a few people get to decide the fate of the entire government. It's an oligarchy, plain and simple. And oligarchies are not just. There's a reason why there are laws against monopolies. Our government seems to overlook it, though, because they enjoy the big dollar donations enabled by Citizens United, and currently they have, the Trump administration, gutted the safeguards against monopolies that the Biden administration had put in place. Lina Khan, being one of the greatest defenders against monopolies, was part of the FTC and basically let go by the Trump administration. So we can see where they're going with this. They want companies to be able to endlessly acquire other smaller companies and cause there to be less and less competition so that they can, the companies, charge as much as they want, costing the consumer more. The competitiveness is lost, and it costs the consumer. It only serves one corporate interest and probably just a few donations. And once that company actually wins, guess what? They have no reason to give you any more donations except to maybe go easy on them on our taxes. But given that that's the case, that it's all about money, it seems, in this administration, and perhaps even going forward if people don't stand up. This means that people of little means, with a perspective of the working class, more often than not are not going to be represented. So it's no wonder these days that the minimum wage has not changed since 2009. There once was an American dream where all could prosper, where the station of your birth didn't define you, instead your hard work did. And many people I know share this same dream and want to make it a reality. And this is what inspires me at Unscripted with Daniel. This is what I want to fight for. So I just want to thank you for listening to this program so far, and I want to continue to put out programs that do empower people with information. Thank you so much. This has been Daniel Donovan on Unscripted with Daniel, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks for joining me on Unscripted with Daniel. And if you're watching on WVOP, be sure to tell a friend about this great broadcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, then subscribe and like this video. Thanks so much. See you next time.